You are not listening to this by accident. Something in you has been moving toward these words for a long time, circling them the way a migratory bird circles the coastline it once knew as home. You might call it timing or a random click or an algorithm's choice, but in the language of depth psychology, there is another name for such meetings: synchronicity, the moment when an outer event bends itself around an inner need. Your unconscious has been arranging this encounter long before you pressed play. For a long time, your life may have moved in what looked like balance. You woke to the same alarm, stepped into the same routines, wore the same expressions that made sense in your world. You played your part at the office, at the dinner table, in the dim light of your phone screen at night so consistently that even you began to mistake the part for the player. In Jungian terms, this role is the persona, the social mask that allows us to function, to be acceptable, to belong. It is not a lie. It is a partial truth, a curated version of you shaped by what your environment could tolerate. The parts that did not fit that mask did not disappear. They sank. The anger you swallowed to keep the peace, the intuition you ignored because it made you inconvenient, the longings that did not match what you were supposed to want, each of these drifted downward into what Jung called the shadow. The shadow is not simply a basement of flaws. It is the repository of all that has been exiled from your conscious identity. Your boldness might be down there. So might your refusal, your erotic heat, your genius, your capacity to say no without apology. They live on in the dark, waiting. The psyche can tolerate this split between surface and depth for a time, often for years. But eventually, the shadow begins to knock. At first, the knocking is subtle. A vague restlessness, a boredom you feel guilty about, fatigue that sleep cannot fix. You notice you feel strangely absent, even while smiling, as if someone else were inhabiting your body and speaking with your mouth. Environments that once felt familiar begin to feel foreign, as though the colors have faded. You may find yourself asking quiet, dangerous questions in the middle of ordinary days. What if this is not my real life? What if I am nowhere in the life I've built? Around this time, the world itself may start behaving strangely. Certain symbols repeat a particular animal, a number, a song that follows you from cafe to street to radio. A book falls open to the exact sentence that names what you could not articulate. A stranger's offhand remark echoes a thought you have been hiding from yourself. Jung would call this the self beginning to signal its presence. The self in his psychology is the deep organizing center of the psyche, the totality of who you are, not just what you have become, but what you were meant to become. When the self wants to be known, it speaks through patterns in your inner and outer life that feel charged with meaning. Your body often understands this before your mind does. Perhaps your skin feels too thin, the world too loud, the light too sharp. You notice a tightening in your chest each time you agree to something that secretly feels wrong, a heaviness in your limbs as you walk into familiar obligations. Sleep becomes haunted. You dream of old houses, flooded rooms, forgotten children, train stations where you never quite bored. These are not random images. They are how the unconscious speaks, presenting you with pictures of your inner situation. A flooded house may show how your feelings have overflowed their old boundaries. A lost child may be the part of you abandoned long ago so you could adapt. This is often the invisible beginning of individuation, the long, disruptive, profoundly sacred process through which a person becomes who they are in their deepest essence. Individuation is not about polishing the persona or becoming a better version of yourself according to cultural standards. It is about the gradual alignment of ego with self, of your conscious life, with the truth of your own center. It begins when the cost of staying adapted becomes higher than the cost of change, when the pain of continuing to betray yourself finally exceeds the fear of what will happen if you stop. At first, nothing dramatic may happen on the surface. No one announces that your life is about to turn. Yet, inside, small revolutions begin. A sentence catches in your throat when you are about to say yes, and instead, you hear yourself say softly, but clearly, I can't. You find yourself staring at your own eyes in the mirror longer than usual, noticing a depth there you do not recognize. You sense perhaps dimly that someone inside has been waiting for you, a quieter, older presence who will no longer consent to be edited out of your own existence. This presence is the beginning of your return. Something subtle begins to unwind in you during this threshold phase, though outwardly, your life may still look intact. You may continue showing up where you are expected, performing the small rituals of belonging you learned long ago. But inside, the architecture is shifting. The old scaffolding beliefs, roles, alliances no longer holds the same weight. This is the liminal period, a psychic twilight in which the persona thins and the unconscious rises. Jung often wrote that the unconscious does not invade the ego violently at first. It seeps in like fog, softening the edges of certainty until you realize you cannot see the road you have been walking on. In this dimness, you may feel a strange mixture of discomfort and possibility. You are pulled inward toward solitude, introspection, silence. Social gatherings drain you, small talk irritates you. Familiar conversations feel scripted. You begin withdrawing, though not in a dramatic way, rather as if your soul is gathering its forces for something deeper. Jung emphasized that withdrawal is not regression, it is incubation. Many transformations require descent into an interior winter, a period when the psyche consolidates energy for the journey ahead. You may experience this as fatigue, as the inability to pretend, as a longing for stillness that others mistake for disinterest. Dreams intensify during this liminal period. A woman dreams of wandering through a forest at dusk, hearing a stream she cannot find. Another dreams of an old woman offering her a candle, or a wolf watching from the shadows. These are archetypal images, expressions of the collective unconscious that illuminate the universal dimension of personal transformation. The forest is the symbol of the unknown psyche. The stream, the life force, the old woman, the ancestral feminine wisdom, the wolf instinct reclaimed. Even if you do not dream vividly, you may feel these archetypes stir in your waking life through sudden intuitions, a rising anger, or a sense of being accompanied by something older than your personal story. It is during this threshold that many women first confront the realization that the life they have been living was constructed in response to external demands. This recognition does not come as a single insight, but as a slow disillusionment. The career you pursued may feel misaligned with your inner purpose. Friendships built on your reliability rather than your authenticity begin to ring hollow. Romantic relationships reveal their hidden architecture, perhaps built not on mutual recognition, but on your capacity to abandon yourself in order to be loved. This is where the father complex often emerges, not as a single remembered event, but as a patterned orientation of the psyche. The father complex in Jungian terms refers to the internalized image of the father and how it shapes authority, worthiness, ambition, and one's relationship to the masculine principle. Many women discover that their striving professionally, emotionally, spiritually was driven by an unconscious wish to win some symbolic masculine approval. Not necessarily the literal father, but the internal figure representing judgment, recognition, and permission. When the mask begins to crack, this complex loosens, and with it, the old compulsions to earn love through performance. As these inner structures weaken, something else rises, a pull toward what is raw, instinctual, unmediated. You may find yourself suddenly annoyed by old expectations. You might feel a surge of anger when someone speaks over you, a clarity when someone minimizes your needs, a sharpness when you feel unseen. This is not a problem of temperament, it is the shadow beginning to surface. Jung taught that the shadow does not only contain darkness, it contains all the vitality you had to suppress in order to be accepted. When the shadow rises, you feel life again, sometimes in disruptive, disorienting ways. Your energy begins to change. Your body becomes more responsive, more honest. You may cry more easily or become more protective of your solitude. You may feel a desire to clean your space, to move, to reorganize, to get rid of objects that feel heavy with old identities. This is the unconscious expressing itself through behavior. The psyche always prepares us for descent before we consciously recognize what is happening. Something in you is clearing space for a journey into your own underworld. This descent is not a collapse, it is an initiation. You are entering the depths not because something is wrong, but because something in you refuses to remain buried. In this liminal twilight, the faint outline of a doorway appears. It is not outside you. It is the threshold of your own psyche, and crossing it will require the courage to enter the territory where your deepest truths and oldest wounds reside. At first, the descent begins quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a soft unthreading of the familiar. You may find yourself lingering in memories without meaning to drawn back to scenes you thought you had outgrown. A childhood room, a kitchen table at dusk, the look on someone's face the first time you learned that love could be conditional. The psyche, when preparing for the underworld journey, begins by loosening the doors of long-sealed chambers. What rises is not punishment. It is memory-seeking integration. In Jungian psychology, this descent is known as the Nikaya, the inward journey into the unconscious, the night sea voyage every soul must undertake when the old life can no longer contain the emerging self. The Nikaya is not depression, though it may wear depression's garments. It is not despair, though it may feel like a darkening. It is the psyche drawing you downward to retrieve what was lost, abandoned, disowned. You do not choose this descent. It chooses you. Your outer life during this time may appear muted. You might find yourself withdrawing from conversations, halfway through staring at walls as though something just behind them is calling your name. A woman once described it to me as the sense that my real life is happening in another dimension and I'm supposed to find my way back to it. This is the language of the unconscious, inviting you deeper into the labyrinth of your own truth. The shadow becomes unmistakable here, not as an enemy, but as a guide. Jung understood that the shadow contains the very substance required for transformation. It holds not only anger, jealousy, and fear, but also autonomy, passion, and a sacred refusal to be diminished. As you descend, you may experience surges of emotion that seem disproportionate to the moment. A small slight ignites a fury you didn't know you carried. A minor boundary crossing unleashes grief that feels ancient. What you are feeling is not about the present, it is the echo of earlier wounds finally given voice. This is where the body speaks most loudly. Tightness in the chest may be the residue of years spent silencing yourself. A knot in the throat may be the words you swallowed as a child. A heaviness in the limbs may be the fatigue of carrying an identity that was never truly yours. Jung emphasized that the psyche communicates through somatic experience because the body remembers what the mind learned to forget. As you go deeper, dreams often assume a mythic tone. The woman who once wandered through a dusk forest now stands before a cave. Another encounters a powerful animal, a lioness, a serpent, a black horse, symbols of instinct returning. Jung saw these animal figures as expressions of libido, not in the narrow modern sense, but as the fundamental life force eros, vitality, desire, will. When such creatures appear, it signifies that psychic energy is shifting from repression toward renewal. You may also encounter ancestral images, faces of grandmothers you barely knew, echoes of women who carried silence so you could carry voice. This is the realm of the collective unconscious where transgenerational patterns reveal themselves. Many women discover that their exhaustion is not solely personal. It is the weight of inherited stories about sacrifice, self-erasure, and duty. The descent allows you to see the invisible threads tying you to the wounds of your lineage. But it also reveals the strengths you inherited: resilience, intuition, the capacity to endure, the capacity to rise. If you are attentive, you may notice the father complex stirring again, but differently now. Instead of driving you to seek external validation, it surfaces as the realization that your inner authority has been overshadowed for years. The internalized masculine, The voice that judges, measures, demands may become loud in the underworld, criticizing your slowness, your sensitivity, your confusion. But this confrontation is necessary. By seeing this inner tyrant clearly, you create the possibility of separating from it. The father complex begins to dissolve when you recognize that the authority you have been seeking outside was meant to be discovered within. In the depths, it is common to feel disoriented. You may question everything: your choices, your relationships, your faith in yourself. But questioning is not collapse. It is rebirth in its first stage. The ego, stripped of its old defenses, becomes permeable enough for the self to emerge. This permeability may feel like vulnerability, and it is. But in Jungian terms, vulnerability is the opening through which the unconscious delivers its messages. The underworld does not immediately offer answers. It offers symbols, sensations, intuitions, each a fragment of your truth. The task here is not to understand them intellectually, but to stay with them, to let them speak. The descent asks only one thing of you: honesty. Brutal, tender, unflinching honesty. This is where the false identities die, not with drama, but with quiet realizations: I cannot live like this anymore. I cannot shrink. I cannot pretend. When you admit these truths, even silently, the deeper work begins. The shadow steps forward, the old complexes loosen, the ancestral patterns unfurl, and somewhere in the dark, your authentic life force begins to stir. As you move deeper into the underworld, something profound begins to happen. The darkness that once frightened you starts revealing its contours. What first felt like disorientation starts to feel like recognition, as though you are walking through a landscape you somehow remember. Jung wrote that the unconscious is not a chaotic abyss, but an ancient terrain with its own laws, symbols, and guardians. When you descend far enough, you realize you are not lost, you are being guided. One of the first guides to emerge is the shadow in its true form, not as a monster but as a mirror. You begin to see all the parts of yourself you exiled because they made others uncomfortable. Your intensity, your ambition, your erotic fire, your anger that once protected your boundaries, your capacity to walk away, your refusal to be lied to. These qualities return not to punish you, but to be reclaimed. They rise with a rawness that can be overwhelming. You may find yourself startled by sudden clarity, realizing in an instant that a relationship is over, that a job is draining your soul, that a pattern you've repeated for years is no longer bearable. This clarity is the shadow reclaiming its rightful place in your psyche. Jung emphasized that integrating the shadow is not about taming its energies, but about coming into honest relationship with them. When anger arises now, it is not the destructive rage you feared. It is righteous, clean directive. It tells you where a boundary has been violated. When desire surfaces, it is not chaotic. It is a compass pointing toward what is alive. When ambition awakens, it is not vanity. It is the soul insisting on its potential. Amid this reawakening, dreams and waking intuitions begin to shift tone. The threatening animals in early dreams often become allies. The cave you once stood before may open, revealing underground rivers or chambers filled with ancient symbols. This is the psyche, showing that you have passed the initial threshold of fear and entered a deeper stage of initiation. Jung would say that the libido, your life force, has begun to move again, no longer trapped in the machinery of adaptation, but flowing toward authenticity. It is usually around this point that the feminine lineage, the collective ancestral feminine, begins to speak. Women often report sudden grief that seems to come from nowhere, or a sense of carrying not only their story, but the stories of mothers, grandmothers, great-grandmothers whose voices were muted. This is not imagination. It is the collective unconscious revealing its patterns. Jung believed the psyche is not isolated. It is a node in a vast web of inherited images and experiences. When you descend deeply enough, you touch this web. You may feel in your bones the weight of generations of women who learned to survive by appeasing, by softening, by quieting themselves. You may sense their exhaustion in your own. But alongside this grief comes something unexpected, a flood of strength. Not the strength of endurance alone, but the strength of ancient knowing, the intuition that once guided women before their instincts were domesticated. You may begin to trust your inner signals more fiercely. You may feel guided by something older and wiser than your conscious mind. As this ancestral layer awakens the father complex, the internalized masculine shifts again. Where it once appeared as a tyrant demanding perfection, it now reveals its deeper wound, the part of you that learned your worth had to be proven. In this space, many women realize how deeply they sought masculine validation externally through relationships or careers, internally through relentless self-measurement. The underworld shows you the cost of this contract, the silencing of your instincts, the surrender of your authority, the habitual self-doubt. But here in this depth, something extraordinary happens. The inner masculine begins to be reconfigured. No longer the punitive voice of judgment, it becomes the supportive structure that allows your feminine nature, intuition, creativity, eros to thrive. Jung called this the healing of the animus. You may feel this as a newfound clarity in your thinking, a stronger sense of inner authority, the ability to make decisions without begging for permission. Your inner no becomes clean. Your yes becomes sacred. And then, like a spark catching fire, the creative libido awakens. This is not creativity in the narrow artistic sense. This is eros, the pulse of life that animates everything. You may feel drawn to movement, to writing, to changing your environment, to speaking truths you once feared. You may feel ideas arriving unbidden or a sudden need to transform stagnant aspects of your life. This is the self preparing for emergence, and it often arrives with an urgency that surprises you. This creative fire does not blaze outward immediately. At first, it glows from within, illuminating long-forgotten corridors of your psyche. You begin to understand why you lived the way you did, not with judgment, but with compassion. You see the patterns of your life not as failures, but as symbols, each one a message from your unconscious asking to be acknowledged. The descent gives you new eyes. You see the architecture of your inner world, the roots of your fears, the origin of your longings. And in this recognition, the possibility of rebirth appears not as a distant promise, but as a presence. Something in you is gathering itself, preparing to rise, not as the person you were, but as the person who has walked through darkness and remembers her own light. As the energies of the underworld settle into coherence, you begin to feel the stirrings of an inner reorientation. What once felt like disintegration now reveals itself as reorganization. The old psychic architecture built from childhood necessity, cultural expectation, ancestral burdens has cracked enough for the self to emerge not as an abstract concept, but as a living center of gravity. Jung described the self as the organizing principle of the psyche, the axis around which meaning constellates. When it awakens, the ego is no longer the frantic manager of life, but a participant in a larger, wiser intelligence. This emergence is not dramatic. It is not a trumpet blast or a lightning strike. It is more like the quiet click of a lock you did not realize was binding you. You wake one morning and notice that the air feels clearer, or you find yourself declining an invitation with no guilt simply because your body whispered, "Not this." You walk into a room where you once felt small, and suddenly you can breathe. This is what it feels like when the ego begins aligning with the self, a subtle but unmistakable sense of coming home to your own life. From this center, the world appears different. Not easier, life still demands courage, but more comprehensible. False obligations begin dissolving on their own. Relationships built on your compliance loosen like old knots. You stop explaining yourself not out of defiance, but because you recognize that truth does not require defense. You notice what nourishes you and what drains you, and your choices begin to shift accordingly without negotiation. This is the beginning of sovereignty, not dominance, not control, but the authority that arises from inner coherence. And with sovereignty comes a certain loneliness, though not the desolate loneliness you once feared. It is a luminous solitude, the kind that accompanies anyone who has stopped living according to the collective script. Jung knew this solitude well. He wrote that the individuated person stands apart from the herd not out of arrogance, but because their inner compass compels them toward their own path. You may feel it now, the slight distance between you and the roles you once played, the widening gap between your emerging truth and the expectations others still project onto you. Some people will drift away, not because you rejected them, but because your new clarity no longer supports dynamics built on self-denial. Others may accuse you of changing, and they will be right even if they misunderstand the nature of the change. They may call it selfishness, instability, rebellion. Yet what is actually happening is reclamation, the return of your life force, the return of your voice, the return of the parts of you that were silenced so you could belong. But as some fall away, others appear, people who recognize the language of authenticity, who respond to your presence rather than your performance. These are individuals drawn not to your persona, but to your essence. Your transformation becomes a signal in the collective unconscious, calling to those who are also awakening. When you stand in your truth, you unconsciously give permission for others to approach their own. With this new alignment, your arrows, your creative libido begins to flow outward. Ideas arrive with clarity. Actions feel rooted rather than reactive. You begin to build a life that mirrors your inner architecture. It does not matter whether the changes are large or small. What matters is that they are real, issuing from your center rather than from fear or obligation. You understand now that your life is not a performance, but an unfolding, and your task is not to perfect it, but to participate in it wholeheartedly. Eventually, after months or years of inner movement, you find yourself in a moment so quiet, you almost miss it, a moment when you look into the mirror and see someone you do not need to betray. A moment when the past no longer grips your throat and the future no longer terrifies you. A moment when the voice within and the life without speak the same language. This is the homecoming, the true return. You realize that nothing outside you has the authority to define you. You realize that witnessing your own soul is the beginning of every wisdom. And then the deepest truth reveals itself not as a thought, but as a knowing. You were never becoming yourself. You were remembering yourself. If this journey has resonated with your own unfolding, I invite you to like, share, and subscribe so that our exploration of the psyche, the mythic feminine, and Jungian consciousness can continue. Share your reflections in the comments. Your story may be the symbol someone else needs to awaken.